in the Middle podcast, the podcast dedicated to the music, movies, and culture of Generation X.
What is up, slackers, and welcome to another episode of the Stuck in the Middle podcast. I am your host, Jason Eck. So we are here another week, and I must say that I've had a rather strange little journey, but it's a journey I've talked about for a really long time, and that's getting my ass back into exercising. So I have gotten 3 consecutive days in, which is the first time in quite some time. I am sore. I am all of that, but I am then reminded how good that feels. And that's been invigorating as much as I'm sore. And yeah, it felt good. So actually I did some lifting and then some cardio. I've been on the treadmill. I've been stretching. In fact, because tonight is recording night, it's the time that I would typically be still in the gym or just getting out of the gym. So, had dinner and all that. But even when I'm done recording tonight, I may just do some deep stretching because it's all about consistency. And once you get started, you have to stick with it. So I am recording some content, nothing super deep, but just kind of have to hold myself accountable. And sometimes by having to do a video with like consecutive days and like showing that you're putting in cumulative work is important, because otherwise I could rest on my laurels. And part of it is that I think I said on the podcast, maybe last week or the week before, where my weight has been. And I think I undershot that by about 5-6 pounds. So I am now at my heaviest that I've ever been. Weighed myself the other day at 220. And, I don't have a big frame, and I'm just like, are you serious? And, yeah, I can't escape it anymore. I'm too old. And as I talked about last week, it gets to be scary a little bit. Gets to be a little bit scary to say, wow, if I have a average lifespan of X and I'm in this kind of shape, like what is it? It's just going to continue to easy for me to say, degenerate. And that's the last thing I want. Like I said last week, I want to be active. I want to do all the things that I hope, like, my grandfather did when I was a kid. My grandfather in his 60s, he's up, water skiing. I want to be able to do that. So we'll see. So the journey has begun. Like I said, I'm just recording my own little vlog about the experience. And I think I'll maybe do that on a weekly basis as opposed to just, okay, day one doing this. But, if you see the content, let me know what you think. I'm going to be open to suggestions, advice, all those kind of things. If I say something and you go, oh, I wouldn't do it that way, I'm happy for the interaction. And I really sincerely mean that. I was hoping after last week I'd have a bunch of emails and people, just sending me random thoughts or even just like topics or things that you'd like to see. I had a couple of great YouTube comments this week. One person was like, hey, you should have put into the chat GPT about all these artists from like the earlier 80s, because I kind of focus on like grungy kind of things, right? And what does chat GPT have to say about Edward Van Halen or Michael Jackson or Prince? Great feedback. And I might do that somewhere down the road. So I really appreciate y'all coming and listening. A couple other things here. If anyone was able to take an opportunity to go to the My Jack family and their GoFundMe, they do post updates there. So it's good to know that my friend Leslie did have surgery, was out of surgery, still going to be in the hospital for a while for recovery and then into physical therapy. But if nothing else, given all of this tragedy, that's a good thing. You always have to find those bits of positivity in these situations, and for her to be able to get the care that she needs, because she's ultimately going to be, the only only person there for her family in that adult role with the loss of her husband. So I think the GoFundMe is still open. If you would like to go out there and help them out, that'd be wonderful. So I just appreciate anyone who might have taken a look at their GoFundMe or even contributed. All of it is really appreciated. So what other things did I want to talk about? Oh yeah, I forgot. So not only have I gone over the 100 episode mark a couple of episodes ago, I'd wanted to do something special for the 100, but I also realized that the people that I would have on as guests and those kind of things, I want to give them notice. And I'd really love to do an episode with a couple of people that are from really disparate corners of my life, like different times of my life, to come together for a couple of topics that I think would be really cool. And they don't know each other. And if you're listening to this, yes, you are probably one of the people I'm thinking about. I would love to have that kind of crossover because we're also from different places geographically and from slightly different, I think, sensibilities when it comes to music, movies, etc. So I think that would be kind of a cool thing that I'd like to have happen down the road. And as you may recall, 2 years ago, so my first year doing the podcast, there was an episode or two that emanated from the Daffodil Festival down in Meriden, Connecticut. That is coming up soon as well. I'm thinking about heading back down there. It's been a little while for the festival and perhaps catch up with some people there as well. And then not only did I reach, over 100 episodes, but this week, this episode is the 2-year anniversary of the show. So between the 100 episode being a milestone and then reaching 2 years of doing this show, and much of it without a guest, just me, and the fact that people still come and listen, and the fact that over the past month or so, where I really thought I had plateaued and kind of like dropped off and was a little bit worried, okay, do I need to change things up? I've had this little surge. So for all of you who have recently started listening to the show, I appreciate it. As I always say at the end of the show, how you can share it and help it to grow. I'm going to keep grinding. Hopefully you all keep listening, and we'll keep doing this. But again, I'm always open for suggestions on topics, things that you'd like to hear, things that you don't like. Because what I find curious is on all the different analytics, you can see where you've picked up and lost subscribers or listeners. I'm always curious, okay, what is it that I said or did or a topic that turned someone off? Or if someone's just like, I'm not really interested in what you have to say anymore. I'd still rather know, hey, tell me why. I'd love to know why people listen and why people choose to stop listening or don't listen, or why a particular episode does well or it doesn't. All of this is feedback. It's the only way that any of us get better. For me, it's ratings, right? So a TV show, it's all based upon ratings. If there are no ratings, there will not be a show. Bands that back when there were record labels, if you don't sell a certain number of records, you're going to be dropped from the label. Simple as that. Well, this is my metric. It's listeners and subscribers and all those kind of things and all the different algorithmic things that exist in the world. There's always been some form of algorithm. There's always been some kind of ranking and rating. It's always existed. And I'm no different. But anyway, for all of you who are here, thanks. And speaking of the music industry, that's what this week's episode is about. It's one that I have been thinking about for quite some time. And I just said, you know what? Just do it. It's going to be pretty niche for some of you. And some of you might even say, well, this isn't so odd. So really what I was thinking about were what I consider to be underrated bands. So the actual title of this episode, as you'll see in the program notes, in the show notes, 3 underrated bands. So I'm going to focus on 3 underrated bands. They all kind of got started in the late 80s and ran through the 90s. And somewhere in that late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of bands kind of broke up. I don't know if it was just shifts in music, in the music industry, and then certainly as we've moved and gradually evolved into the streaming era, with a resurgence in vinyl. I mean, these couldn't be two more opposite and disparate things in my opinion, but those are the two things that are very, very popular. And some of these bands like just disappeared for 5, 10, almost a couple of them, like 20 years, I think, only to kind of see them come back. And I don't know if so much it's maybe necessarily, yeah, I guess it's nostalgia. I mean, it is. If you're in a band that was underrated back then, but now you've gradually seen that people can find your music more easily, whether it is on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Music, whatever it is, then they start to find new listenership. This was actually something that with TikTok, which is constantly under fire, and as it should be, I might start a TikTok, guys. I might. It's just interesting, but everyone's like, if you do TikTok, do it with a VPN, because they're going to track you. Oh, they're already tracking. My FBI guy is out in his van right now. I don't know if he likes the show or not, but he's probably got to listen to it every week. Anyway, I'm joking mostly. Hey, FBI guy, hope you're doing good out there. If you need some snacks, let me know, bro. And but there's a whole new life for a lot of these groups, and TikTok was really starting to bring sometimes obscure songs or songs that have just been forgotten to the annals of time. Now, I'm going to do a whole nother episode on those songs that are, to me, huge hits, and they were legitimately, but somehow, if you don't hit number one, there is like you've reached a certain plateau. So I'm going to give an example, and this is again for a future episode, right? The band Poison, right? They are still able to sell tons of tickets. They did the stadium show in support. Everyone said they were the best of the bands on that stadium show. But it can't be forgotten that despite a run of top 10 hits, top 30 hits, whatever, they had a number one hit single on the mainstream Billboard charts with Every Rose Has Its Thorn. That, you can't take away a number one song. Now, my favorite of the glam bands, the hair bands, if you will, was Warrant. And poor Jani Lane, part of the reason that he had become so despondent and so disillusioned with his career is because he's often considered the cherry pie guy. But here's the thing. They had other hit songs. But their biggest charting hit, Heaven, sat at number 2 and never made it to number 1. Would that have made a difference? I say it probably would, because someone go, oh, Jani Lane, the cherry pie guy, be like, I had a number 1 hit single. I had a number 1 hit song. I don't know. As the old saying goes, if you're not number 1, you're not good enough kind of mentality, right? Number 2 is not 1. You've lost. And I'm sure that Jani Lane felt that way. But anyway, not really what this episode is about. So let's jump in to bands that are underrated. Now I have some honorable mentions. Now these first 2 are kind of under the umbrella of the hair bands, which means they were kind of successful anyway. These 2 bands both have, I think one has a platinum record, one has a gold record. So they are different than everything else I'm going to talk about on the episode tonight. But I can't help but say they're underrated, because they are. Now, the first one is a band that I've talked about because they're on my playlist. If you go back and listen to the Hair Metal Mixtape, great episode, in my opinion. Kix. Now, Kix had a big hit with Don't Close Your Eyes, but for me, the song Cold Blood is hands down one of the best, if not the best, hooks, like the chorus of like any song from the era. Should have been number 1 hit. It is a fantastic song. So as a band, I've gone back later on. I didn't appreciate them back then either. I didn't. They skipped by me. Maybe they just weren't flashy enough. Too much in that AC/DC by Aerosmith kind of vibe. Totally underrated. Another band that I thought was kind of, again, lumped in with being somewhat derivative of other bands of the time, Dangerous Toys. Now, they had a bunch of really great, fun songs, like Teasin' Pleasin', right? Teasin' Pleasin', Give the Dog a Bone. Scared, which was kind of an homage, like Alice Cooper and the Scary songs. But then the kind of the gem of that first Dangerous Toys record, it's the last track of the album, Queen of the Nile. I've mentioned before, also on the hair metal mixtape, Queen of the Nile is such a good song. Lead singer Jason McMaster is definitely in that kind of Axl Rose vein, but excuse me, I think overall the band was very, very different, but still coming from that like bluesy kind of background, but they're Southern. You know what I mean? Just a little bit of a different vibe. So the next category in the honorable mentions, bands that have at least one album that I love. Now, these two records are kind of related because there is a musician who is in both. And the first one you can say is his main band, his main claim to fame. And then the other is this weirdo project that I talk about any opportunity that I get. So first off, we have Shudder to Think and the Pony Express record, which came out in 1994 on Epic Records. The singles on this, songs like Hit Liquor, right? Great song. X French T-shirt, which later on was covered by Incubus, which has some of the best, I guess you can call it droning. It's hard to describe this feeling I get if you listen to that song. Because I have only the one ear, I can only imagine what it sounds like in stereo, but definitely in the car, you just crank that tune and it just has this hypnotic effect to it. But that Pony Express record is excellent. And they were kind of that 120 minutes, which that whole era of music is you had stuff that was really, really heavy. I mean, they were definitely leaning into like the metal side of music, but they weren't metal. That's where that 120 minutes was so curious, is because you could get something jangly like, I don't know, the Dead Milkmen, or you can have something like Shudder to Think, but then you could also have like Danzig, or you could have, They Might Be Giants. Very different stuff. So that's what's kind of fun about alternative music at that time. But Nathan Larson, guitarist for Shudder to Think, put out this crazy little record with a bunch of his friends, some members of the Dam Builders, etc. I've talked about it before on one of the other episodes, but Mind Science of the Mind. Very difficult to find, but because Shudder to Think was on Epic Records, this got released on Epic Records, which I didn't even realize. I thought it was on like a boutique label, but it may have been like distributed by Epic. But there's a couple of songs on there that are available on YouTube and like some like, I think what's it called? FM, whatever, where you can find like some weird recorded stuff. But Oceans Don't Need Us. Just beautiful. Beautiful. This whole record is like oddly beautiful. It's like a pop record. And like 5 of us know about it. Check it out. It's so good. And then the song called To the Tender, Beauty Marks Blisters. There is, I don't know, again, it's so hard to describe this album because it kind of goes everywhere from traditional hard rock to vaguely R&B to like experimental. There's a lot of, so it's Mary Timony. I don't know, what is her name? Hold on a second. I want to make sure I have the name right here. And we have Joan Wasser. So it's Joan Wasser from the Dam Builders on violin. So Mary Timony is in Mind Science of the Mind. I just always get the names kind of inverted in my head. Anyway, I think it's Kevin March on drums and Joan Wasser on violin. So both from the Dam Builders, which are from the Boston area, and they're excellent. I should say they relocated to Boston. I guess they got started in Honolulu, but everyone knows them as a Boston band. Anyway, I just recommend that album. If you can find it, I think if you like a little bit off the beaten path, alternative rock from that mid 90s era, I think you should check it out. So now let's get into the meat of the 3 underrated bands. So the first band we have was formed in 1986. Although the members of the band are originally from New York, they relocated to that San Francisco Mission District area, which boasted such bands as Faith No More, Luscious Jackson, Beck came out of that scene, Primus. And this is also 86. You have to remember they're in Metallica country kind of thing, right? But Jawbreaker, Blake Schwarzenbach on guitar and vocals, Adam Fowler on drums, and Chris Bauermeister on bass. And they had 4 full-length records. And I'm kind of going to go through them, but I'm going to focus on the records and the songs that I recommend for these bands. Now, if you've heard of them, you're going to go, how are they underrated? And they just had this reunion tour that was very well received. Bear in mind, they didn't sniff a gold record. They didn't. And I think they're amazing. And anyone who knows them thinks they're amazing. And they have all these little interesting kind of connective tissue with some of the biggest bands of that era. And a couple of those bands, one of them in particular, is a huge arena touching on stadium level group. And they have some, like I said, connective tissue there. So their first album, Unfun, came out in 1990 on Shredder Records. I have to be honest, not really my cup of tea from their discography. My least favorite of the record, and really not much for me to say about it, other than the fact that you see the foundation of the band, and it's definitely they joke about what is punk. What is punk? And I think that they are a band that, particularly for the next 2 records were described as like the 2 like most sacred documents of what would become emo, right? Like, this is the template. Here it is. This is it. And those are the records that touch me. So what I'm talking about is Bivouac, released in 1992. Now, bear in mind, I did not know of them in 1992. Honestly, I'm talking to my buddy Carlos, if you're listening. I don't know how the hell we weren't listening to Jawbreaker in 1992. Bivouac, released on Tupelo Recording Company. The songs on here that I think are the best. So first of all, Chesterfield King. It's an excellent song. It can't be denied. It's often going to be called one of the greatest songs of their discography, and that everyone will be like, on that record, Chesterfield King is top notch. I mean, it really is. Great chorus, some really cool lyrical, just weaving of a great story, and a sweetness. There's just such a sweetness to it, but it's got a nice edge to the guitar. It's such a fantastic song and a fantastic kind of encapsulation of the band in that era. They also have this great cover of You Don't Know What You Got by Joan Jett. So if you know the song, which was out in that, which record of hers? I'm going to have to go back and look, but this is like a peak Joan era song that didn't get ever released as a single. It's so good. Such a good cover. But also the title track, Bivouac. It has this just such a noisy section and like this breakdown that's so killer. And again, it's hard to describe them exactly because they're rooted in punk without a doubt, but also I think influenced by a lot of kinds of music, including bands like The Replacements, for example. Great album. But the one that really got me hooked, and my buddy who turned me on to a couple of these bands, he always knew which albums to kind of hook me with, right? I think I've talked about this album before too. 1994's 24-Hour Revenge Therapy. This is my springtime album. So as soon as I can roll down all the windows in my car and open the sunroof, when it gets to be like 55 degrees, out comes 24-Hour Revenge Therapy. Because the opening track hooks me every time. All these years later. So lazy. This came out in 94. I probably was first exposed to them 2 years later. So probably 96. Yeah, that makes sense. But The Boat Dreams from the Hill. What a long title. But that's the opening track. And I'll just say that the lyrics are, I want to be a boat. And just go listen to it and you'll see how it all makes perfect sense. There's the song that I am surprised somehow didn't become at least a minor radio hit, because I don't even remember it being played on any of the college or indie stations out here on the Northeast. I don't know how. It seems like this would have been a perfect song for it, but a song called Do You Still Hate Me, which is one of my favorite things just to play on guitar when I'm noodling around. Hooky chorus, great story. It's a perfect song. It's a perfect song. And then the closing track, In Satting Around, which has one of the coolest lyrical turn of phrase. And I dip my toe in this cold, cold life. I want to dive, but I can't find your feet. You with a view so unlike my own. It's a long way down again. It's just, you'd have to hear it. I'm doing it a disservice because it's not just the words. It's with the music. It's all together. And In Satting Around is such a great song. And the opening guitar, bass, drum, it's perfect. But here's where the connective tissue happens. 24-Hour Revenge Therapy was recorded with Steve Albini. And Steve Albini would then go on to record In Utero. And it was in part because the Nirvana, Nirvana, that band, heard 24-Hour Revenge Therapy. And Albini, I think, went right from that into, well, actually, you know what? This says it came out in 94? I could have sworn it came first. 24-Hour Revenge Therapy. Steve Albini. Let's take a look at his discography. If you ever want something fun, Steve Albini does a cover of Lido Shuffle. It's just so stupidly good. And it was just like at like a party or like a gathering. And it was so good. Let's see. That's right. His band is Shellac. And then as producer, where is it as producer? Oh my gosh. Listen to this. 1992. Sorry, we're kind of, we're jumping again, but this was his 92. John Spencer Blues Explosion, The Jesus Lizard, Helmet, Meantime. Recorded by Albini, mixed by Andy Wallace. I mean, are you serious? For those who know, no. Let's see, 93. Oh my gosh. So he recorded it. Gotcha. In 93. It didn't get released until 94. So he did do this first. So, but listen to this. PJ Harvey, Rid of Me, Jawbreaker, 24-Hour Revenge Therapy, Nirvana, In Utero. Like, that's just right in a row. What a tremendous little piece of business right there. I mean, talk about getting your name with some of the greatest recording artists of the 90s. Yeah, I did another Jesus Lizard record, Melt Banana. I saw them live. Don't ask me why. Let's see. Killdozer. So good. Screeching Weasel. The Auteurs. Silkworm. He did a bunch of Silkworm records. Oh my gosh. He did Razor Blade Suitcase by Bush. No kidding. Oh, he did a Low record. That's cool. Oh, and he did Scrawl. Okay, sorry. Guided by Voices. Holy Baruch Assault. All right, I'm done. I'm sorry. I got a little excited there. My apologies. It's good to still get excited at my age. Okay, so that's not all. So those are my two favorite records, Bivouac and 24-Hour Revenge Therapy. But they were then, so those two records, Tupelo Recording Company, those are both released there. They get signed to Geffen frickin' Records, right? And Geffen at this point is like signing a bunch of indie bands. But this next record, Dear You, their first and only major label release, I don't love this record. I don't. It's okay. Came out in 1995. So you've already had Steve Albini do 24-Hour Revenge Therapy. But this, Dear You, was produced by Rob Cavallo, who had just done a little record called Dookie by Green Day. Understand that Jawbreaker predates both Nirvana. I guess Nirvana really did kind of get started around the same time. But Green Day, Nirvana, like you listen to Jawbreaker, if you've never heard them before, and you find the time after you listen to this podcast to listen to Jawbreaker, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I totally get it. And why here's a band that probably should have broke, maybe not as big as Nirvana and Green Day, but they needed to be in the conversation. And it's kind of absurd that they didn't. Moving on. Next, we have a band that, again, if you watched 120 minutes, you'll know who they are. Again, I did not happen upon them until a little bit later, but also formed in 1986 in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Afghan Wigs. Lead vocals, rhythm guitar, Greg Dooley. Oh, you know, I'm gonna come back. So, Rick McCullum on lead guitar, John Curley on bass, and Steve Earle on drums. So very quickly, there is something I want to point out. So going back to Jawbreaker, Blake on guitar played a Les Paul, and it comes through in the music. And Adam Fowler, Chris Baumeister on bass played a Fender Precision bass. So that has a very specific sound, right? But when we talk about the next two bands, there's also some just kind of interesting things. I just wanted to point out what they played. Because like you can almost cut and paste some of these guitar and bass tones, and you'll find out what I mean by that in just a little bit. So anyway, their first album, the Afghan Wigs, was called The Big Top Halloween, released in 1988 on Ultra Suede Records. I will tell you, like the first two records of the band, I'm just like, oh, this is a thing that happened. And it's interesting because you kind of hear them in their very formative stages, still learning to become themselves, right? So Big Top Halloween, I don't really have much to say about. I've heard it like once or twice. Same thing with Up In It, 1990. But what was interesting about Up In It, which is the first record that I heard, it was on Sub Pop Records. Now, Sub Pop, of course, is known for being the Pacific Northwest. It's all the bands up in Seattle, right? In Portland, and all those kind of bands. They gave birth to grunge. The Afghan Wigs were only the second band not of that geographic region to get signed to Sub Pop. Now, what I find so interesting about that is that within two records, they couldn't be further away from some of the other stuff that was happening in that scene, with the exception of the Screaming Trees and Mark Lonergan, who was very good friends with Greg Dooley, and they did some work together. Which kind of twins were they? Gutter twins? Because there's all kinds of twins, because there's the, what do they call, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards? They were the something twins. Let's see. Dooley and Lonergan. Gutter twins. I was correct. Whew. Thought I had that wrong. Once in a while, the old noggin works. They did a bunch of work together, but the first record that I really hopped onto, and again, this was later. Actually, you know what? Maybe I only heard like one song and up in it, because again, it was a friend who recommended. He would like just give me a bunch of CDs and go, "Hey, check these out." But the first one that I really listened to fully and had like any connection with was Congregation, which was released in 1992 on Sub Pop. But it still wasn't like, I was like, okay, I'm interested in this band, but I didn't love them, right? That didn't happen until I listened to 1993's Gentleman, which was their first release on a major record label that was Elektra Records, which before that had really been known for a lot of metal bands were out in Elektra. But like, I just fell in love with this record. And there are songs on there today that I will still have in a playlist. So I'm just going to point out like kind of my highlights, right? Just as I did with the other record. The song Gentleman itself is excellent. And I've longed to look at it as being structurally, and if you listen to them side by side, you might think I'm nuts, and that's okay. But I look at it as being somewhat of an analog to Only by Anthrax. Gentleman and Only to me is this weird little mashup in my brain where there's similar structure, in my opinion. And Gentleman is such a great song. That was also on regular rotation on 120 Minutes. But the other song is a song called My Curse. My Curse should have been a radio hit, in my opinion. If for no other reason than around this time, PJ Harvey was getting airplay. And even if it was just like college or modern rock radio, My Curse, which was not sung by Greg Dooley. There is a version where he does sing, but it's Marcy Mays from the band Skrull, which, as I mentioned before, was, produced by Steve Albini. This is one of the most beautiful, sensual, but subversive, dark, maybe this relationship is not good. Now, that's kind of the entire theme of Gentleman. The whole record is this sleazy, sensual mess of Dooley being very much, at this phase in particular, not seemingly a big fan of romance or in the potential for romance to be lasting, or maybe not even being interested in romance lasting. Certainly a lot of misogynistic undertones in this record, but it's excellent. Gentlemen, 1993, Elektra. But that is not my favorite Afghan Wigs record. Now, that came later. That came in 1996. So I almost got to this one in real time. Okay. I think by the time I heard it for the first time, it'd been out for 6-9 months, somewhere around there. So also out in Elektra. This is a loose concept album that Greg Dooley has mentioned in the past could have or should have been a soundtrack for an album. and that the album itself could have been a film, a la a Tommy or Quadrophenia, right? I think it could be. It is cinematic in its scope, and a somewhat less cynical view of romance. And in fact, the protagonists of the record, if you will, are going to town. And that's one of the songs, Going to Town. Going to town, burn it down. You get the match. Well, how's it go? Hold on. It's so good. I thought I had this ready in my brain. But here's where my age is kicking in. I'm an old man and I can't remember. Okay. No, that's not the song. What? No, I don't even know what song that is. It's a different song, Going to Town. Apparently there's a few. Okay. Go to town, burn it down, turn around and get your stroll on, baby. I'll get the car. You get the match and gasoline. It's so good. But what about this? And as we ride away into the countryside, I feel as though I must confide. There is a cost when you say, now we got hell to pay. Don't worry, baby, that's okay. I know the boss. Oh my gosh, it's such a good frickin' record. Okay, again, I'm fanboying out, getting a little excited. Sorry, getting a little excited. But Going to Town only pales in comparison to Summer's Kiss. Now, Summer's Kiss is likely my favorite Afghan Whig song. And I don't know how to me, it is like a fully realized movie in my head every time I listen to it. And all I can say is I can imagine a vaguely Katharine Hepburn-like character, or maybe more appropriately, a Patricia Arquette era, like true romance. Maybe even a little bit of Mira Sorvino, but you can imagine her with a handkerchief over her head and sunglasses on and, you know, getting into a convertible. And like the guy is kind of a roughneck, and Summer's Kiss is over, baby. It's over. You know, it's so good. And then there's Honky's Ladder, which is just so funky. So funky. And that's where I mentioned before, kind of the connective tissue with the instrumentation. So Greg Dooley, for this time period, was mostly playing a Telecaster. Rick McCollum on lead guitar was playing a Fender Jazzmaster, and John Curley was playing a Rickenbacker. Now, Dooley nowadays is playing a Gibson ES335, so that's the semi-hollow, and I can see how that would be the instrument that he uses nowadays, but there's just something about, if you take a listen to these records, there's just something about it being played with a Telecaster for a lot of the rhythms. You can just see it. And that Rickenbacker bass sound, that's just so thick and so good. It really comes out in Honky's Ladder, along with, you know, they've always, or not always, but at least from, I think, Black Love on, have consistently had a keyboard, like, organist in the band regularly. I mean, the band got bigger and bigger, particularly for touring, as the songs became much more intricate and orchestral. But yeah, that record, Going to Town, Summer's Kiss, Honky's Ladder, I would start there. Then in 1998, the album 1965 came out on Columbia Records. And I would say this is probably their most accessible record. And there's a song on there called 66, which did make it into the soundtrack of 10 Things I Hate About You. But there are so many good songs on this record. It doesn't quite live up to Black Love fully, but in some ways, I mentioned the orchestration, it becomes even more They called that their New Orleans time period. That's where they recorded the album. There definitely is that sensibility. Lot of horns, and it shows way funkier. So they were a band that was very much grunge, but think about it. They're coming out of Cincinnati, Ohio, which has, a R&B background, and they've mixed it. It's like grunge. And then it was like grunge with like some R&B, but it just got more and more R&B, but then darker lyrically. It's just such a journey. There's such an interesting mashup of band, and there is no one out there like Greg Dooley. But one thing you'll notice about both, Jawbreaker and Afghan Wigs is you have lead singers with a raspy voice. I do like a raspy voice. I like Tom Waits. I'm less of a huge Bruce Springsteen fan, but I mean, you can't tell me Thunder Road isn't a perfect freaking album, because it is. You know what I mean? No, Born to Run. Thunder Road's the song, right? Yeah, Thunder Road's a song that happens to be on Born to Run. Sorry, I had a moment. But Born to Run, that whole record, amazing. Some would say, the best of his work. I don't know, but I do like that raspiness. Yeah, I'm not a huge Aerosmith fan, don't really like that. But after 98, the Wigs played for a couple of years, just touring kind of thing. And then I think 2001, they basically called it quits. But they did get back together. But I will tell you, I've tried to listen to these new albums, and there's plenty of bands like Faith No More, like Anthrax, that have kind of come back and are making, in my opinion, some of their best music in this latter stage of their career. You have to get me with the first song, though. And none of the first songs on these three releases have caught me instantly as the prior Afghan Wigs records had. So they had Do the Beast, which was released Due to the Beast in 2014 on Sub Pop. In Spades in 2017, also on Sub Pop. And then most recently, How Do You Burn, released in 2022 on Royal Cream BMG Records. I don't really have a lot to say about them, but they are a band that I feel like I need to just go back and listen to them and see if maybe I'm missing something. But they're still putting out music seemingly, and I think they're back out on tour this year. So I might check them out, because it's been a minute since I've seen them live. The last time I saw them was on that 1965 tour. I actually saw them at a club here in Boston. It was the Afghan Wigs and the Sheila Divine. What a great show. Ooh, I should have put Sheila Divine on my list. But anyway, the last band, one of my favorite bands of all time. So I put Afghan Wigs as one of my favorite bands of all time. I think that Jawbreaker is probably, if not my top 10, then definitely my top 20. But I've talked about them before. Only 2 records, but these 2 records are near and dear to me. Talking about Black Train Jack. Now, 3 of the 4 members were in another band called Token Entry. They're coming out of the New York hardcore scene. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But you have Ernie Prada on guitar, but also vocals, Brian Goldstein on bass, Rob Attal on vocals, and Nick Furlano on drums. Now, their 2 records, which came out in 1993 and 1994, both came out on Roadrunner Records. Now, you have to understand that the hardcore music scene at the time, you could think of bands like, let's say, Sick of It All, or Biohazard, even bands like Snapcase and Integrity, Josta 14, later Hatebreed. Was it Iceburn, or is it Frostburn? Okay, Iceburn. But, these were kind of like the bands. And there was definitely this kind of metallic vibe of this era of hardcore. But there's another era of hardcore too, which is bands like, the Circle Jerks and Murphy's Law and, I'm not going to say, I almost said G.G. Allen and his crew. But Gorilla Biscuits, right? So bands that were much more rooted in like the punk elements of it, right? But a lot of those bands that were at the time were definitely dialing into the metal. Like you can't listen to a band like, Hatebreed now, which came out of like Ajasta, and not say that metal is like a big influence, because it clearly was. And a lot of the bands that would play had that. But then you have Black Train Jack. Truly a hardcore band. But you could tell that their influences, they weren't shy about sharing. And they would have been just as influenced by a Ramones or a Misfits, but honestly, like a Talking Heads or even a Cheap Trick, New York. I'm sure bands like Kiss, because they leaned into the melodic, which to me says, much like a band like Jawbreaker has been called like a godfather or a template of emo. In some ways, I look at Black Train Jack as also having been a huge part of that. Because I'm going to tell you right now, I've gone back and I've been listening to the records again recently, particularly the You're Not Alone record. For those of you who don't know, bands like Fall Out Boy started in the hardcore music scene. These records, without a doubt, if you're going to tell me that Pete Wentz has never heard Black Train Jack, I would call bullshit on that. Honestly. Great vocals. They sometimes did the gang vocals because that worked. But great melodies. I'm going to use a couple of the songs. So, A No Reward, their debut record on Roadrunner. One of the songs that is a highlight is a song called Guy Like Me. It's a pop song. It's a pop punk song. Before that was even like called a thing. And it has like a doo-wop section and like these great pauses and a build up into a big chorus. They're noodling around at kind of the breakdown section using the bass line from Jeopardy. Doo, 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 doo. Like just a little bit of humor, but a killer pop song. But then they'll have a song like No Reward, the title track. Heavy. But I think their best song, my opinion, and it's a song that I'm proud to say that my son has on his rock playlist, because it's all genrefied. He has like a mixed playlist, but like he talks about rock, his rock playlist. Leapfrog, which is actually lead vocals are Ernie, guitar player on this. It's a great pop song. Great pop song. Great little guitar solo, like everything you want. And it's just like, boom, like 2 minutes long, right? So bear in mind, you have all these typically young men who are going to these hardcore shows. And here's a song that really is kind of uplifting and just positive energy. The whole band was positive energy and still just everyone getting down to the music. Such a powerful feeling. They were always so good to see live. But yeah, on that No Reward record, Guy Like Me and Leapfrog, top notch. Leapfrog is just one of the best songs ever, and that no one knows about, and that's bullshit. And then You're Not Alone. This also has some standouts on it. So the song The Reason has one of the greatest opening guitar riffs in history. That's not hyperbole. Like if you like punk rock music, it's killer. But it then goes in a completely different direction for the full song into those first verses. It's so cool. It's so well structured. It's showing that they were something different than a lot of the other bands that were coming out at that same time. Bands that were their contemporaries, which is why I'm telling you, you listen to that You're Not Alone record, you can see why and how some of the bands that came later in like the emo scene even happened. Handouts, like the opening track. Amazing. Amazing. And here's a straight edge band. And I'm going to get into a little bit about the straight edge thing in just a minute. They do a cover of Steve Miller's The Joker. We talk about being a midnight toker and all that, right? Because like, yeah, we don't necessarily relate to some of that stuff, but we love this song and we thought it would be fun to do it like heavier. Right? Because that's, hey, it's a song that influenced them. Man, you remember singing that song when we were kids? Yeah, it was great. Let's do a cover. It wasn't a matter about whether the lyrical content matched up. So why that's important? I've never denied the fact that it's party boy. Drank and smoke and did all that stuff, right? So we would go to these hardcore shows. A lot of times they were straight edge. Not always, sometimes. But we went and saw Black Train Jack pretty much anywhere we could go to within a certain radius. And we'd be out there having a cigarette. And it was never judgment by the band. So Ernie'd be out skateboarding, for example. This happened to us a couple of times. Man, you guys, you really shouldn't smoke. It's going to kill you. No finger wagging. Just, guys, we see you at shows. Maybe they don't know us by name, but that doesn't matter. They know us by face. They know that we've been at the shows. And, hey, guys, you should not do that to your bodies. Okay. We know, Ernie. All right, man, as long as you know. Goes back off skateboarding, whatever. Never about judgment. And that's just really cool. Because there's some people that were in that scene that would be very judgmental. I've met them. But yeah, just such cool guys. Rob, the lead singer, he passed away a couple of years ago and gosh, it was 50s. Maybe he didn't even make it to 50. It just sucks. Just sucks. Cause they're a band that, gosh, I wish they'd be, because I think they did a reunion. I think, Carlos, if you're listening, I think you went to their reunion show in New York. Yeah, they're like no other band. I think that's why they just stood out so immediately. Just something really, really special that not enough people have heard. But Ernie, he played a Les Paul. Now I mentioned, Blake. Les Paul, nice, heavy, like all the Gibson stuff. I always look at as being like good, yeah, rock and roll. You know what I mean? And then Brian was also playing the Rickenbacker bass. There's the part of me that wished that Chris from Jawbreaker wasn't playing the P bass and that he was playing the Rickenbacker, because then it would have just been such perfect symmetry where like all the bass players were rocking the Rickenbacker. I think that'd be cool. But I definitely think, because I mean, like I said, Dooley started out playing the Telecaster, but morphing into a Gibson guitar. I don't know a ton about guitars. I know a bit. I just know that from the pickups perspective, it's what's called the lipstick pickup on the Telecaster. You just can't get that same crunch as you can with those Gibson guitars. And even, design wise, I just think that, the Fender Stratocasters are for more, how do I put this? Cleaner sounding rock and roll. Not that it's bad, I just think of like the guitarists that I typically have latched onto or really enjoyed their music have typically been playing, Gibsons. They've been playing, Les Pauls, SGs, but then also like the BC Rich stuff, but then like some of the heavier bands that are, playing like, ESPs and like Jacksons and stuff like that. Anyway, I'm digressing, but Black Train Jack out on Roadrunner Records at a time when Roadrunner was filled with bands like Typo Negative and Fear Factory. I think Corrosion of Conformity was on there at that time. I definitely know Machine Head was on there. Dog Eat Dog, Biohazard, I think had just finished on Roadrunner and got signed. Sick of It All was on there at the time. So they were just this little interesting oasis in the middle of a lot of much heavier, angrier bands. And I just love them. Just absolutely love them. So anyway, those are my 3 underrated bands of the late 80s into the 90s. Tell me what you think. Do you have some underrated bands from this time? Some kind of under the radar artists? Maybe you're going to say a Concrete Blonde. I would say that's an excellent choice. Bands like that. I'm interested. Please let me know. And how do you do that? You can email me at stuckinthemiddlepod@yahoo.com. You can find me on Instagram, X, and YouTube at StuckPodX. Head on over to the Facebook page, Stuck in the Middle, a Gen X podcast. Please like, comment, share, leave 5-star reviews, and most importantly, please subscribe to the podcast. So until next time, later, slackers.